My dear fellow Americans, what they just announced is worse than we thought, and I mean that literally. 3 days ago, Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook stood in front of a microphone and said 5 words that should have stopped the country cold. She said, "Inflation is simply too high. Not elevated, not concerning, too high." Those are the words of a sitting Federal Reserve governor, describing the current state of the American economy in July of 2026, after 3 years of being told that inflation was coming down, that the worst was behind us, that the economy was on the right track, and it gets worse. The new Federal Reserve Chairman Kevin Warsh held his first FOMC meeting in June, and his post-meeting comments deliberately dropped the usual reference to the Fed's mandate of maximum employment. He talked about price stability. Only price stability. Markets interpreted that as hawkish, meaning rates are more likely to go up than down. And prediction markets are now pricing in a 52% probability of a rate hike before the end of 2026. Not a cut, a hike. So let me walk you through everything they just announced and why it is, without exaggeration, worse than we thought. The Fed just admitted inflation is the highest since 2023, and it's still climbing. Let's start with the numbers that Governor Cook cited in her speech on July 15th, because these are not projections or forecasts. These are the actual measurements of what is happening right now. The May Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers showed annual inflation accelerating to 4.2%, the highest reading since April 2023. Core inflation, which strips out food and energy, climbed to 2.9%. And here is the part that should alarm every American who was told the inflation crisis was over. Governor Cook said explicitly that last summer, in 2025, it was reasonable to expect inflation to return to a downward path after one-time price increases from the tariffs. But, she said, tariff-related price increases appear to be mostly behind us, and yet inflation has moved higher. Read that sentence again. The tariff price increases are largely done, and inflation still went up. That means the inflation is no longer being driven by tariffs alone. It is being driven by something structural, something embedded in the economy that is pushing prices higher independent of trade policy. And that structural driver is what makes this situation worse than we thought. Because if inflation were just about tariffs, it would be a one-time adjustment that the economy could absorb and move past. But if inflation is structural, if it is being driven by labor costs, by housing costs, by healthcare costs, by the cumulative effect of 6 years of monetary expansion, then it does not self-correct. It persists, it compounds, and the only tool the Fed has to address it, interest rates, is a blunt instrument that cures inflation by crushing demand, which means crushing the consumer, which means crushing the 2/3 of GDP that depends on consumer spending. Governor Cook's admission that inflation is simply too high despite tariff effects fading is the most consequential economic statement of 2026, and almost nobody covered it. And I want you to understand what 4.2% inflation actually means for you, because the number sounds abstract until you translate it into your household budget. At 4.2% annual inflation, a family spending $6,000 per month on necessities, which is approximately what the median American household spends when you include housing, food, healthcare, insurance, transportation, utilities, and debt payments, is paying $252 more per month than they were a year ago. That is $3,024 per year in additional costs that must come from somewhere. And the median household income has not increased by $3,024. It has increased by approximately $1,500 to $2,000 in nominal terms, which means the gap between the cost increase and the income increase is approximately $1,000 to $1,500 per year. That gap is being filled by savings depletion, which explains the 2.6% savings rate, by credit card debt, which explains the record delinquency rates, by BNPL plans, which explains the 29% financing groceries on installment, and by 401k hardship withdrawals, which have tripled since the pandemic. Every month that inflation runs at 4.2% and wages grow at 2 to 3%, the gap widens, the savings drain faster, the credit cards fill faster, the BNPL balances climb faster, and the consumer, who is 2/3 of the economy, moves 1 month closer to the point where there is nothing left to drain, nothing left to charge, and the spending simply stops. That point is not far away. The data says it is approaching, and the Fed just confirmed that the inflation is not coming down, it is going up. The new Fed chairman dropped the employment mandate from his first statement, and Wall Street noticed. Kevin Warsh took over as Federal Reserve Chairman after Jerome Powell's term ended in May. His first FOMC meeting was in June, and what he said and what he didn't say sent a clear signal to financial markets about where monetary policy is headed. In his post-meeting comments, Chairman Warsh emphasized the committee's near-term focus on price stability without the usual reference to its other mandate of maximum employment. Now, if you are not a financial markets person, that might sound like a minor detail. It is not. The Federal Reserve operates under a dual mandate established by Congress. The first mandate is price stability, keeping inflation under control. The second mandate is maximum employment, supporting a strong job market. Every Fed chair since Paul Volcker has referenced both mandates in their public statements because both are legally required objectives. When Warsh dropped the employment reference, it told Wall Street that the new Fed chairman is willing to sacrifice jobs to fight inflation. That he views inflation as a bigger threat than unemployment. That if forced to choose between letting inflation run hot or letting unemployment rise, he will choose higher unemployment. And the bond market responded immediately. Short-term rates rose because traders priced in the possibility of a rate hike. Long-term rates fell because traders priced in the possibility that aggressive inflation fighting would slow the economy. The yield curve flattened, which is historically associated with tighter financial conditions and slower economic growth. And prediction markets now assign a 52% probability that the Fed will hike rates at least once before the end of 2026. Think about what a rate hike means for you. Your mortgage rate goes up. Your credit card APR goes up. Your auto loan rate goes up. Your business line of credit goes up. Your home equity line goes up. Every variable rate obligation in your financial life becomes more expensive. And the cost of the rate hike falls disproportionately on the people who are already the most financially stressed. The people with variable rate debt, the people with credit card balances, the people who are financing their groceries on BNPL plans. The people who can least afford a rate hike are the people who will pay the highest price for one. And let me walk you through the specific math. Total U.S. credit card debt is approximately $1.21 trillion. The average APR is approximately 22 to 23%. A 25 basis point rate hike, which is the smallest increment the Fed typically uses, would add approximately $3 billion in annual interest costs across all credit card holders. That might not sound like much spread across 190 million cardholders, but for the individual who is carrying a $8,400 balance at 22.75%, which is the average balance for revolving credit card holders, a 25 basis point increase adds approximately $21 per year. Not devastating. But add it to the $252 per month in additional costs from 4.2% inflation. Add the potential gasoline increase if oil hits $150. Add the tariff second wave that the NY Fed says is coming. Add the healthcare premium increase from the ACA subsidy expiration. The rate hike is not the cause of the crisis, it is the additional weight placed on a structure that is already sagging under cumulative load. And the point at which the structure fails is not determined by any single weight. It is determined by the total load. And the total load on the American consumer right now is the heaviest it has been since the Federal Reserve began measuring consumer financial stress. And the new Fed chairman just signaled that he is willing to add more weight. Not because he wants to harm consumers, because the inflation that is harming consumers requires aggressive action. And the only action the Fed has is the interest rate lever. And the interest rate lever, when pulled, generates pain. And the pain falls downward. Always downward. Americans just bought 1.3% less food in real terms. And the Chicago Fed called it a sharp deterioration. The Chicago Federal Reserve quietly released spending data in June that 24/7 Wall Street described as surprisingly bad economic news. After adjusting for inflation, Americans bought 1.3% less food and services in May than they did previously. That is not a rounding error. That is a sharp deterioration from April's flat reading and February's 0.8% increase. The trajectory is unmistakable. Americans are buying less food, not because they want less food, because they cannot afford the food at the prices the food now costs. And this is happening while inflation is accelerating to 4.2%, meaning the prices are going up while the consumption is going down. That combination, rising prices and falling consumption, has a name in economics. It's called stagflation, and it is the worst possible economic condition because there is no clean policy response. You cannot cut rates to stimulate demand because that would accelerate inflation. You cannot raise rates to fight inflation because that would further crush demand. The Fed is trapped, and the consumer, who is the engine of 2/3 of the American economy, is the one trapped inside the machine. And the 24/7 Wall Street analysis was blunt. They said the 70% engine of the U.S. economy is finally fatiguing. That word, fatiguing, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because fatiguing doesn't mean the engine has failed. It means the engine is losing power. It is still running, but it is running slower, and if the conditions that are causing the fatigue, rising prices, falling real income, depleted savings don't change, the engine will eventually stop, and when consumer spending stops, GDP contracts, and when GDP contracts, it is called a recession. And nobody in an official capacity is using that word yet. But the data is whispering it. And if you know how to listen to data, the whisper is getting louder every month. And here's what makes this data point particularly alarming when combined with the inflation data. In economics, there is a concept called the misery index. It was invented by economist Arthur Okun, and it is simply the unemployment rate plus the inflation rate. During the stagflation of the late 1970s, the misery index hit 20%. Today, with unemployment at 4.3% and inflation at 4.2%, the misery index is 8.5%. That sounds manageable compared to the 1970s. But the misery index does not capture the reality of a 2.6% savings rate, 6.43% credit card delinquency at smaller banks, 29% BNPL grocery financing, and 95% of the population reporting an affordability crisis. The misery index was designed for an era when consumers had savings buffers, when healthcare was employer covered, when housing was affordable, and when the social safety net was intact. In that era, an 8.5 misery index was indeed moderate. In an era where consumers are depleted, where healthcare premiums have doubled, where housing consumes 40 to 50% of income, and where the safety net was just cut by $1 trillion in Medicaid and $295 billion in SNAP, the same misery index translates to far more actual suffering than the number suggests. The index measures the temperature, but the patient's immune system has been compromised. And a fever that a healthy patient can fight off becomes life-threatening for a patient whose immune system is already weakened. The American consumer's immune system, their savings, their credit capacity, their safety net, has been systematically weakened over the past 3 years. And the fever is rising. The savings rate crashed to 2.6%, and 29% of Americans are financing groceries on installment plans. Forbes reported that the personal saving rate fell to 2.6% in April, the lowest since before the pandemic. Real disposable personal income dropped 0.5% in a single month. And yet nominal spending increased, which means Americans are spending more dollars to purchase less actual goods. They are paying more for less. And the gap between what they earn and what they spend is being funded by the destruction of their savings and the accumulation of debt. A 2026 Lending Tree survey found that 29% of Buy Now, Pay Later users are now using installment loans to buy groceries. Nearly half, 47%, made at least one late payment in the past year, up from 34% the year before. More than half say they could not make ends meet without the loans. The Richmond Federal Reserve estimates total BNPL transaction volume reached $70 billion in 2025, growing roughly 20% per year. And at banks outside the top 100 by asset size, where lower-income borrowers are concentrated, credit card delinquency rates have hit 6.43%. That is where the real economic stress lives. Not at JP Morgan and Bank of America, whose wealthy clientele is still doing fine. At the smaller banks, the community banks, the banks that serve the Americans who are actually struggling. And a Harris poll conducted for The Guardian found that 95% of Americans believe the country is in an affordability crisis. 95%. When 95 out of 100 people agree on anything, it is not an opinion, it is a census. And the census says the economy is broken. And the data confirms what the census says. Savings depleted, credit maxed, delinquencies rising, real spending falling, prices still climbing. And the Fed is considering raising rates further. That is worse than we thought. By every measure, by every data point, by every reasonable interpretation of what the numbers are telling us. Inflation is no longer just tariffs, and the Fed just told you what is actually driving it. Governor Cook's speech 3 days ago contained an analytical insight that most of the media missed entirely because they were focused on the headline about inflation being too high. But the substance underneath the headline is far more important. She said that tariff-related price increases appear to be mostly behind us. The one-time adjustments from the 2025 tariff regime have largely been absorbed by the economy. And yet inflation moved higher, not lower. So if tariffs are not the primary driver anymore, what is? Cook pointed to several factors. First, labor productivity is booming, growing about 2.5% per year over the past 2 years. Under normal circumstances, that should suppress inflation, because more output per worker means lower costs per unit. But the productivity gains are being captured by the AI-driven technology sector and by corporate margins rather than being passed to consumers through lower prices. The productivity is real, the price relief is not. Second, the data center build-out that is powering the AI revolution is adding what Cook called some heat to the economy. Billions of dollars are being poured into server farms, chip fabrication, and energy infrastructure to support AI. That spending is inflationary because it competes for construction labor, electrical capacity, and raw materials with the rest of the economy. Third, and this is the one nobody wants to talk about, housing costs continue to be the single largest contributor to core inflation. The shelter component of CPI remains stubbornly elevated because the housing supply has not expanded fast enough to meet demand, and the existing stock is repricing upward as insurance, property taxes, and maintenance costs climb. The inflation is structural. It is embedded in the cost of AI infrastructure, in the housing market, in healthcare, in insurance, and in the profit margins of corporations that have discovered they can raise prices without losing market share because consumers have no alternatives. And structural inflation does not respond to one rate hike or even two. It responds to sustained tightening that produces enough economic pain to force prices down, and that pain falls on workers, not on corporations, on consumers, not on shareholders. On the 95% who already say it's a crisis, not on the 5% who don't. And here's the part that really gets me. Governor Cook also said that labor productivity is growing at 2.5% per year, which is booming by historical standards. Under normal circumstances, booming productivity should reduce costs and reduce inflation. More output per worker equals cheaper goods per unit. But the productivity gains are not flowing to consumers through lower prices. They are being captured by corporate margins, by shareholders, by the technology companies whose AI tools are driving the productivity improvement. The companies are producing more per worker. They are charging the same prices or higher, and the difference is profit. Not your profit. Their profit. The productivity miracle that was supposed to be the antidote to inflation has instead become a mechanism for wealth extraction. The workers produce more. The companies charge the same. The margin widens. The worker's wage grows at 2%, while the company's productivity grows at 2.5%, and inflation runs at 4.2%. The worker falls further behind every month despite being more productive than at any point in history. That is not an economy working as designed. That is an economy designed to produce exactly this outcome. And Governor Cook, to her credit, noted the phenomenon. But noting it and fixing it are two different things. And the Federal Reserve has no tool that addresses the distribution of productivity gains. It has only the interest rate lever. And the interest rate lever does not redistribute gains from capital to labor. It redistributes pain from the financial system to the household. And that redistribution is what the new Fed chairman just signaled he is prepared to do. Federal employment has been slashed by 348,000 positions, and the downstream damage is just beginning. While the new Fed chairman focuses exclusively on price stability and drops the employment mandate from his vocabulary, the federal government has been conducting the most aggressive workforce reduction in modern American history. Forbes documented that federal government employment has fallen by 348,000 positions since October 2024, an 11.5% reduction. The information sector, which includes technology and media, has shed 342,000 jobs, an 11% decline from its 2022 peak. And Brookings warned that with dramatically reduced immigration, healthy monthly job growth could fall to zero or even turn negative by 2027. Average monthly employment growth has been just 17,000 since April, a level that historically would signal a labor market in crisis. But the unemployment rate has not spiked because the labor supply has also contracted. Fewer workers are entering the system because immigration has been cut. Fewer workers are being counted as unemployed because some have dropped out of the labor force entirely. The unemployment rate is stable at 4.3%, but the stability is masking deterioration underneath, the way a frozen lake looks stable while the ice is thinning from below. And the downstream effects of the federal workforce reduction are cascading through the communities that depended on those jobs. The restaurants and daycare centers, and auto repair shops and grocery stores that serve the families of federal workers are losing revenue. The property tax base in government-heavy suburban communities is contracting, and the agencies that are supposed to implement the massive policy changes in the OBBA, the Medicaid work requirements, the SNAP changes, the student loan overhaul, have lost the staff needed to execute the implementation. The Department of Education staff has been cut so dramatically that Brookings questioned whether it can manage the student loan transition at all. And the people who will pay the price for that implementation failure are not the policymakers who created it. They are the borrowers, the Medicaid enrollees, the SNAP recipients, who will be navigating a new system managed by agencies that no longer have the people to manage it. The trade deficit just widened to $77.6 billion, and that tells you everything about where this economy is headed. U.S. Bank's weekly economic outlook, published 6 days ago, reported that the U.S. trade deficit widened in May to $77.6 billion, up from $54.6 billion in April. Exports fell 3.2%. Imports rose 3.3% to their highest level since March 2025. That widening deficit tells a story that contradicts the narrative of a strong economy. When exports fall, it means the rest of the world is buying less from us, which signals weakening global demand. When imports rise simultaneously, it can mean domestic consumers are spending, but when combined with the savings rate collapse and the BNPL data, it more likely means consumers are front-loading purchases in anticipation of further tariff-driven price increases, buying imported goods now before the prices go up again. That front-loading produces a temporary boost in import volumes and GDP that evaporates once the purchases are made. It is not sustainable demand. It is panic buying dressed up as economic activity, and it widens the trade deficit, which means more dollars flowing out of the country, which puts additional downward pressure on the dollar, which makes imports more expensive in the future, which feeds back into the inflation that is already too high, according to the Fed governor, who said so 3 days ago. The trade deficit is not an abstract number. It is a measurement of the gap between what America produces and what it consumes. And at $77.6 billion per month, that gap is approximately $930 billion per year. America is consuming nearly $1 trillion more per year than it produces. And the difference is funded by borrowing from the same countries that are systematically reducing their exposure to the US dollar. China has reduced its treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion to $760 billion. Central banks are buying gold at record pace. The dollar's share of global reserves has declined from 71% to 59%. The world is gradually, methodically reducing its willingness to fund America's overconsumption. And when the funding stops, the consumption stops. And when the consumption stops, the GDP that the consumption supported collapses. And folks, this is where the trade deficit connects to the dollar's reserve status in a way that most people never hear explained. The United States has been able to run massive trade deficits for decades because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Foreign countries sell us goods. They receive dollars. They use those dollars to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which funds the U.S. government's deficit. It's a circular system that works as long as the rest of the world wants to hold dollars. But when central banks start diversifying away from the dollar, which they are doing, the demand for U.S. Treasury bonds declines. And when demand for Treasury bonds declines, the interest rate the Treasury has to offer to attract buyers increases. And when Treasury rates increase, every other interest rate in the economy increases with them, including your mortgage rate, your auto loan rate, and your credit card rate. The trade deficit, the dollar reserve status, and your personal interest rates are all connected by a chain that most Americans have never been shown. When the trade deficit widens to $77.6 billion in a month, it is not an abstract number. It is a measurement of how many additional dollars are flowing out of the country and into the hands of foreign central banks that are increasingly choosing to convert those dollars into gold rather than into treasury bonds. And every dollar that goes to gold instead of treasuries is a dollar that is not funding the U.S. government's deficit, which means the deficit must be funded at higher rates, which means your interest costs go up. The chain is real. It is operating right now, and it just got $23 billion longer in a single month. The housing market has entered its own recession, and the median home just hit $440,600. One economist quoted by Newsweek put it plainly. He said that one of the few places in the economy where you can speak definitively about recession conditions is housing, and the picture there is not good. Long-term sales declines and sluggish construction activity have led him to conclude that the housing sector has already slipped into its own recession. U.S. Bank confirmed that the median existing home sale price rose to a record $440,600 in June, but was up just 1.8% from a year earlier, well below the pace of headline inflation. On an inflation-adjusted basis, the median sales price remains approximately 6% below its June 2022 peak. So prices are at nominal records but declining in real terms, which means homeowners are paying record prices for assets that are losing real value, and the housing market is stuck in what economists call the lock-in effect. Approximately 80% of existing mortgage holders have rates below 5%, many below 4%. They locked in those rates during the pandemic, and selling their home means giving up that rate and purchasing at 6.5 to 7%, which in many cases doubles their monthly payment. So they are not selling. Existing home sales remain at historically depressed levels. Inventory is building not because sales are strong, but because demand is weak. And new construction is slowing because builders cannot sell into a market where buyers cannot afford the rates. The housing market is frozen from both sides. Sellers won't sell, buyers can't buy. And the prices, propped up by the lock-in effect rather than by genuine demand, sit at levels that are unaffordable for first-time buyers and declining in real terms for existing owners. That is not a healthy market. That is a market that is waiting for the catalyst that breaks the equilibrium. And if the Fed raises rates, as prediction markets now suggest is more likely than not, the equilibrium breaks on the buyer's side, rates go higher, affordability gets worse. The remaining buyers at the margin exit the market entirely, and prices which have been held up by artificial scarcity begin to decline as sellers who can no longer wait are forced to list at prices the market can actually bear. And when housing prices decline while inflation runs at 4.2%, the real decline is even steeper. And the household wealth that is concentrated in home equity, which is the single largest asset for the median American family, erodes with it. Folks, I want you to understand the full picture of what they just announced, because nobody is putting it together for you in one place. 3 days ago, a Federal Reserve governor said inflation is simply too high at 4.2%, the highest since 2023, and that it is rising even though tariff effects are fading. The new Fed chairman dropped the employment mandate from his first public statement, signaling that fighting inflation will take priority over protecting jobs. Prediction markets now price in a 52% chance of a rate hike this year. The Chicago Fed data shows Americans buying 1.3% less food in real terms, a sharp deterioration. The savings rate collapsed to 2.6%. 29% of Americans are financing groceries on installment plans. Credit card delinquencies at smaller banks hit 6.43%. The trade deficit widened to $77.6 billion as exports fell and imports surged. Federal employment has been cut by 348,000 positions. Monthly job growth has averaged just 17,000. And the housing market has entered its own recession, with the median home at $440,600 and locked-in owners refusing to sell. Each one of these data points by itself would be concerning. Together they form a picture that is, without exaggeration, worse than we thought. The economy is not recovering. It is deteriorating underneath a surface of stable unemployment and positive GDP growth that masks the structural decay in savings, in consumer capacity, in housing, in trade, and in the purchasing power of the dollar that is losing value at 4.2% per year, while the people who hold it are earning 0.01% at the bank. Stay informed, stay prepared, and do not let anyone tell you the economy is fine when every piece of data says otherwise. May God bless you all, and thank you for watching. And if this video helped you understand what the data is actually saying underneath the headlines, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the difference between the people who navigate what is coming and the people who are blindsided by it will come down to one thing: information. Not money, not connections, not luck, information. And the information in this video is the kind that the evening news will not give you, that the official reports bury in technical language, and that the people who benefit from your ignorance would prefer you never hear. You heard it. Now act on it. Stay prepared, stay informed, and stay vigilant.